The day my daughter-in-law called to brag that she had used my inheritance to buy her dream beach house, I sat at my small kitchen table, with the phone pressed to my ear, and felt something inside me go very, very still. She laughed and said I would never see that money again, that I should be grateful she was taking care of it. And for a moment I just listened, like I was listening to a stranger who had somehow learned my number. I did not shout, I did not beg. I let her talk about ocean views and fancy parties, and how I might be invited once, maybe, if I behaved. And while she spoke, I found myself staring at the old calendar on my wall, at the date I had circled weeks earlier, the day I sat in a lawyer's office and moved every last cent of that inheritance into a place she could not touch. When she finally paused to take a breath, I simply said, "Is that so?" And she laughed again, certain she had me where she wanted me. She thought she had taken my future. But what she did not know, what she could not even imagine, was that this little call of hers was the beginning of the end of her own plans. So if you have a moment, sit with me, and I will tell you exactly how that money disappeared from under her hand, and how the truth about her past walked right up to her and knocked on the front door of that beach house she was so sure she had already bought. Thank you for watching my story and for sitting here with me for a while. It would mean a lot to me if you could tell me in the comments where you are watching from. I like to picture the places where hearts are listening on the other side of this screen. My name is Mary, and I live in a small town in Iowa. Nothing fancy, just an old house that creaks when the wind blows, and a kitchen table that has seen more tears and laughter than I can count. I have lived a long life in this place. I raised my son here. I cooked his school lunches in that faded yellow kitchen. I sat up at night waiting for him to come home from ball practice. I ironed his shirts before interviews and prayed quietly over his pillow when he was too grown to let me pray out loud. This house is not the kind of place my daughter-in-law would ever brag about. There are no marble floors or ocean views. The couch is old but clean. The curtains are worn but washed, and the plates in my cupboard do not match. Still, every corner of it holds a piece of my history. Every picture frame on the wall carries a moment I thought our family would always protect. I never imagined that one day I would sit in this same kitchen and listen to someone who married into my family speak to me like I was an obstacle in the way of her dream. I am telling you all this because I want you to understand that before there was an inheritance, before there were bank papers and trusts and bounced payments, there was just a woman who worked hard, who believed that if she gave her best years to her home and her loved ones, she would be treated with respect in the end. I worked in a grocery store for a long time, stocking shelves, ringing up customers, standing on tired feet while my back ached. I took extra shifts when the bills were too high. I learned how to stretch soup so it could last 2 days instead of 1. I learned how to smile even when my hands were shaking from worry. When my sister left me that money, it did not feel like winning the lottery. It felt like someone had finally put a blanket over my shoulders after a lifetime of standing in the cold. I thought it might mean a little security, maybe fixing the roof properly, maybe not having to choose between new glasses and a dental visit. I never once thought of a beach house. I did not even dream in that direction. That was another world, the world my daughter-in-law came from in her mind. A world of perfect pictures and online posts and showing off to people who did not know the truth behind the scenes. When she married my son, I wanted to welcome her. I really did. I told myself that the way she wrinkled her nose at my old armchair did not matter. I told myself that her remarks about wanting a better neighborhood were just young ambition. I swallowed so many little comments for the sake of peace. I told myself that as long as my son was happy, I could survive a few careless words. But words are like drops of water on stone. Over time, they carve deep lines, and one day you wake up and realize you no longer feel at home in your own life. By the time that phone call about the so-called beach house came, I was not just an old woman being tricked. I was a mother who had slowly watched respect disappear from her own dinner table. And as I sit here in Iowa telling you this, I want you to know that this is not just a story about money. It is a story about what happens when someone thinks they can take your history, your sacrifices, your very name, and turn it into a down payment on their idea of a perfect life. I remember the first day my son brought her to this house. It was a Sunday afternoon. The kind of quiet day where you can hear the refrigerator humming and the clock ticking in the hallway. I had made a simple meal: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans with a little butter. Nothing special. Just the kind of food that had carried us through years when money was thin but love was not. She stepped through the door in high heels that clicked on my old floorboards, looked around like she was walking through a museum of things that should have been replaced. She smiled at me, but her eyes went straight to the furniture, the curtains, the chipped edge of the coffee table. She called my living room cozy, but her voice had that slight tilt that said she meant small. When we sat down to eat, she barely touched the food, just picked at it, and asked my son about his job, his plans, his salary. And when he mentioned my late husband's small pension, I saw her eyes light up in a way that made my stomach tighten. Later that night, after they left, I stood alone in that same quiet kitchen and rinsed plates under warm water, thinking about the way she had talked about their future. Big houses, better neighborhoods, better schools, everything bigger and better. And the only time my name came up was when she said, almost casually, that at least he had me, that not everyone had a parent who could help them get started. The words slipped out of her mouth like a compliment, but they landed on my heart like a warning. I did not know it yet, but that was the first small crack in the wall of trust I had built around my family. As the months went by, those little comments that first sounded harmless began to grow sharper, like tiny stones in my shoe that I kept trying to ignore. They would come over for dinner, and while my son helped me carry dishes to the table, she would stand in the doorway and scroll through her phone, showing him pictures of bright white kitchens and wide-open living rooms with floor-to-ceiling windows. She would turn the screen toward me and say things like, "Can you imagine waking up to this view instead of this little street?" As if my home was a temporary stop on the way to something real. One evening, she walked through my hallway, tapping the walls with her knuckles, and laughed that at least when I moved into assisted living, they would not have trouble selling this place. My son chuckled weakly and told her not to talk like that, but he did not tell her it was wrong, and that bothered me more than her words. Another time at dinner with some of their friends, she made a joke that with his career and my careful saving habits, they would be set for life as long as no one did anything silly with their estate. Everyone laughed, and I felt my face grow warm as if I had been stripped down to numbers on a page. That was the moment I understood something important to her. My life was not a story of scraped-together rent, second-hand coats, and quiet prayers in the dark. It was a future fund, a resource, something to be managed and folded neatly into her plans. I still smiled. I still poured coffee and cut slices of pie. But inside me a quiet voice had started to repeat the same sentence over and over. "You need to be careful now, Mary. You are not being seen as a person anymore. You are being measured like a bank account." When my sister passed, everything those two kept saying about my so-called estate suddenly had a new weight to it. I remember the day the lawyer called me. I was standing at my kitchen sink, rinsing out a coffee cup when the phone rang. His voice was gentle. He told me my sister had not only thought of me in her will, she had left me an amount of money that made my knees feel weak. $500,000. I had to sit down, right there at the table with the old vinyl seat cracking under me, because I had never seen that many zeros next to my name. All at once I saw my sister's face in my mind. The two of us as girls sharing a bed in a drafty room, passing one pair of gloves back and forth in winter because we could not afford two. I thought of the years we both spent making do, patching, sewing, praying, and now here she was, gone, leaving me a gift that felt too heavy and too kind at the same time. It did not feel like a ticket to luxury. It felt like a blanket thrown over my shoulders after a lifetime of cold. I did not tell my son. I did not tell my daughter-in-law. I did not even let the word inheritance cross my lips. All I said was that I needed to go into town for an appointment. I put on my plain coat, the same one I have worn for years, and walked into the office of the lawyer who had helped my late husband and me with paperwork long ago. He pulled out an old folder with our names on it, pages we had signed back when my husband was still alive, and we were thinking about what would happen if one of us went first. There was a trust already written there, waiting quietly all these years. He explained that this new money could go straight into that trust, that it could be protected, that it would take more than a smiling face and a marriage ring to reach it. As he talked, I thought about every little comment my daughter-in-law had made, every glance she had sent at my house, every joke about assisted living and selling this place, and my hand stopped shaking. I told him I wanted that money moved immediately. No delays, no loose ends. He showed me the numbers on the screen, the transfer going from the account with my sister's name to the trust in mine, and I signed the papers with a pen that felt unexpectedly heavy. When I walked back out into the sunlight, the town looked the same. Sidewalk cracks were still there, the same cars rolled past, but inside I felt something shift. For the first time in a long while, I was not standing there as someone waiting for whatever my son and his wife decided. I was standing there as a woman who had quietly taken her life's last big chance and put it somewhere safe. I went home, made myself a simple sandwich, and as I ate it at my small kitchen table, I decided that no one needed to know about those numbers except me and that lawyer. Because long before my daughter-in-law tried to turn my future into her beach house, I had already decided that my sister's last act of love was not going to be poured into someone else's dream of status and show. It was going to be guarded until I knew exactly what kind of hearts were standing on the other side of that door. Not long after I moved that money into the trust, my daughter-in-law came by one afternoon with that same bright smile that never quite reached her eyes. She said she was just dropping in to check on me, but she floated through the house like she was taking inventory. Her purse was hanging off her arm, one of those expensive bags with a shiny logo that could probably pay my heating bill for a month. When she finally sat down at the kitchen table, she set it on the chair beside her, half open, while she talked about interest rates and property values and how smart it was to get in on the market before prices went even higher. I listened, stirring sugar into my coffee. And out of the corner of my eye, I saw something that made my hands stop in midair. Inside that open purse was an envelope with documents peeking out, and on the top page, in bold letters, was a last name I did not recognize. It was not my son's, and it was not the name she used now. I did not lean over or touch anything. I just let my mind take a picture of that word, while I nodded and pretended to be interested in her story about some friend who had flipped a house and made a small fortune. Later that night, after she had gone home, and the house was quiet and the dishes were done, I sat at this same table with a piece of paper and wrote that unfamiliar name very carefully. Then at my next appointment, I slid that paper across my lawyer's desk and asked him a simple question. I said, if someone marries your son and changes her name, but you find another name on legal papers in her purse, what would you do? He looked at the name, his face changed just slightly, and he told me he would look into it. There was nothing dramatic. No big scene. Just a phone call a few days later that felt heavier than any storm. He told me that under that other name there were 2 bankruptcies filed in different states. There was a fraud case that had been dropped after a settlement. There were records connected to older relatives whose savings had somehow disappeared in the process of helping her with business ideas and investments that never became anything. As he spoke, I felt my heart sink. Not because of the numbers, but because I could suddenly see my son standing in the same line as those other people, hopeful, trusting, and slowly drained. I sat there with my hands folded in my lap, listening to the details, and all I could think was that the jokes she had made at my dinner table were not jokes at all. They were a pattern playing out in slow motion. When I left his office that day, I did not rush home to shout or accuse. I walked slowly, one foot in front of the other. And I made a different decision. I decided to stay quiet and watch, not because I was weak, but because I needed to know where my son's loyalty truly rested, with the woman who had already taken so much from others. or with the mother who had spent her life giving him everything she could. I knew then that if I opened my mouth too soon, he would run straight home and hand her my warning like a weapon. So instead, I went back to my kitchen, put the kettle on, and waited for the day when her own choices would show him what my words could never prove on their own. It did not take very long for the pressure to start. One evening they came over together, my son looking tired around the eyes and my daughter-in-law glowing with a kind of excitement that made my skin prickle. She had a neat stack of papers in a folder, and that careful voice people use when they are pretending to be worried about you, but are really worried about something else. She sat down at my kitchen table like it was a boardroom and said they had been talking about my future, about how dangerous it was for someone my age to be handling money alone, how there were scams on every corner, and how I could make one wrong decision and lose everything. My son nodded along, not really looking at me, just tracing the edge of his coffee cup with his finger. She told me they had spoken to a friend who worked at a bank, that the smart thing was to give someone responsible power of attorney so they could manage my accounts, pay my bills, and make sure I was not taken advantage of. She slid the papers toward me and to do was sign. It was for my protection. She said, her eyes shining in a way that told me exactly whose protection she was really thinking about. My hands did tremble a little, but not from fear of the papers. From the ache of knowing my own son had sat quietly by while his wife reduced me to a risk on a spreadsheet, I took a slow breath and told them that I was grateful they cared, that of course I would never want to be a burden, but that I had a rule. I never signed anything important without letting the lawyer who had helped me for years take a look first. She did not like that. I could see a flash of annoyance before she smoothed it over with another smile. She said something about not wanting to waste his time, that it was just a formality, but I stayed firm. The next day, I took those papers back to the same office where we had made the trust. My lawyer read every line. He explained that as written, this would have given her broad power over my older accounts, but not the trust we had already locked down. He looked at me and asked if I wanted any of it at all, and I told him yes, but on my terms. I wanted something limited, something I could undo, something that would look to them like a door opening while still keeping the real door bolted. So he adjusted the language, narrowed the powers, made sure that no matter how many signatures they waved around at a bank, they would never be able to reach the money my sister left me. When I brought the papers back signed, my daughter-in-law practically glowed, thanking me, calling me wise, talking about how much easier things would be now, and I just smiled and nodded, because I understood something she did not. She thought she had just been handed the keys to my future, but all she really held in her manicured hands was a small window into an account that barely carried enough each month to keep my lights on. Everything else was already resting somewhere she would never see, waiting silently for the day when her own greed would write the next chapter of this story for me. After those papers were signed, there was a change in the air that even I could feel. Sitting alone at my kitchen table, my daughter-in-law started talking differently, not just about my safety or my future, but about what she and my son were going to do once everything was organized. She would drop hints in every conversation, telling me about a beach town she had always loved when she was younger, describing houses with tall windows and long decks that looked out over the water. She would turn her phone toward my son and show him listings, little pictures of white railings and blue skies, and say things like, "With the right help, this is not as far out of reach as it looks." My son would smile, tired but hopeful, and sometimes he would glance at me with that mixture of guilt and excitement that said he had convinced himself I would be happy to see them have more than I ever did. One afternoon she stood at my sink, looking out the small window at my quiet street, and said very softly, almost to herself but loud enough for me to hear, "I cannot wait until we are not stuck looking at this kind of view anymore." Then she turned to me and added that once everything was settled with my finances, it would be so much easier for them to make smart moves for the whole family. She sat with her laptop open at my table, clicking away, and I watched the way her eyes narrowed in concentration, the way her lips curved when she thought she had found a way forward. I knew she had started accessing that old checking account through the authority I had allowed her. I recognized the signs of someone who believed they finally had their hands on the steering wheel. She spoke about down payments and transfer limits, and how convenient it was that my pension and other small deposits went into that same account. She never said the word inheritance out loud in front of me. But every time she mentioned how lucky we all were, that I had something set aside after all these years, I could hear it echoing under her breath. At night, when the house was quiet and the refrigerator hummed and the street outside was empty, I would sit with my bank statement in one hand and the trust papers in the other, running my finger over the lines that proved the $500,000 was locked away where she could not touch it. More than once, I called my lawyer just to hear him confirm it again. He reminded me that no matter what forms she waved at a teller, that trust would not open without me standing there in person and speaking my own password. His voice calmed the small knot in my stomach, not because I doubted the law, but because I knew what was coming. I could feel it, like you feel a storm building, even when the sky is still clear. I saw the way she walked now, a little lighter, as if she had already moved into that fantasy house by the sea. I heard it in the way she spoke about next month, about dates circled on her calendar, about meetings she would soon have at the bank and with a real estate agent. And while she painted those pictures out loud, my son nodding along, I just folded my hands in my lap and listened, thinking to myself that there are some truths you cannot tell a person. Some truths they have to meet themselves when they sit down in front of a stranger, sign their name, and hear the word declined spoken out loud in a room that has no sympathy for their dreams. The day of that phone call, I was sitting right here at this same kitchen table, the afternoon light coming in through the window and landing on the worn wood like it had 1,000 times before. I had my hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea when the phone buzzed and her name lit up the screen. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something in me said answer. So I did. Her voice came through bright and sharp, full of sugar and steel. She did not ask how I was or what I was doing. She went straight into it. She said, "I just wanted you to know I used your inheritance to buy our beach house." Her words were slow and deliberate, like she wanted to savor every syllable. She talked about how beautiful it was, how there would be room for guests if they ever felt like inviting me once, maybe, how it was time that money did something useful instead of sitting in an old account under my name. When I asked quietly, my inheritance, "What do you mean?" she laughed, a high little laugh that made my skin crawl, and told me my son had given her power of attorney, that she had just left the bank where she signed the papers to move the money, that I should feel relieved because now, as she put it, someone responsible was handling things, while she bragged about ocean views and decks and how smart they were to move fast. I stared at the corner of my table where the wood is faded from years of plates and elbows and homework, and I felt not panic, not even shock, just a deep, cold stillness, because I knew something she did not. I knew that the account she thought she had reached held little more than grocery money and utility payments, while the $500,000 she was so sure she controlled was resting untouched in a trust she could not even see. When she finally paused for breath, I simply told her I hoped everything went smoothly for her at the bank. And with the purchase, my voice as calm as if we were talking about the weather, she mistook my quiet for defeat. She told me I should be grateful she was taking such good care of my future, then hung up with one last satisfied sigh. I sat there for a moment, listening to the empty line. Then I set the phone down, took a slow sip of my now cooling tea, and instead of crying or shaking, I reached for the number of my lawyer. Because I understood that the real storm was not what she thought she had done to me. It was what she had just done to herself, in front of people who would only care about what the bank screen showed them when her grand plan tried to turn my life into her beach house. When my lawyer picked up, I told him exactly what she had just said, and he listened without interrupting, then reminded me in that steady voice of his that the trust was untouched, that no signatures she had waved at a teller could open it without me standing there in person. Hearing those words settled something inside me. So I thanked him, hung up, and went to bed that night with my mind strangely clear. The next day, while I was folding laundry in the living room, the phone rang again. This time it was my son. His voice tight and hot in a way I had not heard since he was a teenager. He did not say hello. He launched straight into it, asking why the money was not in the account, why the bank had told them there were nowhere near enough funds for the transfer they had tried to make. I could hear noise in the background, angry whispers, a woman's sharper tone, and I realized he was calling me from the parking lot of the real estate office where they had just tried to put that beach house in their names. He said the word embarrassed like it was choking him. That they had sat there in front of the agent, in front of her parents, while the payment was declined again and again. He said I had made them look foolish, that Emma had told him everything was arranged, that I had agreed, that this was supposed to be a family move. I let him talk until his anger ran in circles. Then I took a slow breath and told him the truth in a calm voice. I said, I moved the money weeks ago, on purpose, because I know how to read a document. And then, very quietly, I added, and because I know your wife's real name. There was a long silence on the other end. The kind where you can almost hear someone's heart dropping, as all the pieces they have been ignoring suddenly start to line up. He finally whispered, "What are you talking about?" And I told him that if he wanted answers, he should come see me alone, without her sitting beside him and speaking for both of them. I did not shout, I did not apologize, I simply set the terms. Because in that moment I understood that the money was not the only thing that needed protecting. The truth about who she really was had been waiting in a folder on my table, and the time had finally come to open it in front of my own son. He came the next evening, just like I asked, alone. No car doors slamming twice, no sharp heels on my porch. Just my son standing in the doorway with his shoulders slumped and his eyes looking everywhere but at mine. I had the folder already on the table. The same worn table where I had once helped him with homework and birthday candles. He sat down quietly, and for a moment we just listened to the old clock on the wall. Then he asked what I meant about her name. His voice smaller than his anger had sounded on the phone. I opened the folder and slid the first few pages toward him. Records with that other last name, court documents showing bankruptcies, notes about a fraud case that had been settled out of sight, and a pattern of older relatives whose savings had vanished after helping her with her plans. While he read, the color slowly drained from his face. He tried to say there had to be some mistake, that maybe it was someone else with the same name, so I showed him the addresses that matched stories she had told, the dates that lined up with times she said she had been just unlucky. And I watched the moment recognition hit him like a stone. I told him I had not shown him any of this sooner, because I knew he was in love. And love can make ears go deaf, even when the truth is shouting. I reminded him that I had moved the money not to punish him, but to stop the same pattern from swallowing his life the way it had swallowed other people before us. He put his hands over his face and sat there in silence for a long time, and I wanted nothing more than to reach across and hold him. But I stayed still, because there are some lessons a mother cannot soften. When he finally looked up, his voice was hoarse as he asked if the money was really gone for good from her reach. And I told him yes, it was safe, and that what happened next between them was no longer about dollars. It was about whether he could keep ignoring who she had chosen to be long before she ever walked into this house. It was only a few days later when she came storming into my house without even knocking. Her face tight, her voice already raised before she reached the kitchen. She accused me of humiliating her, of ruining their chance at the beach house, of making her look foolish in front of the agent and her parents. She said I had betrayed them, that I had promised to let them handle everything. I stayed seated at the table and told her to sit if she wanted to talk, stand if she wanted to shout, but that in this house I would not be spoken to like an enemy. My son stood near the doorway, silent, holding himself as if he was afraid to touch either wall. When she asked again where the money was, I told her calmly that the money she believed she had moved was never there. that long before she ever touched that old checking account. The inheritance had gone into a trust with rules she could not bend. She laughed and said I was lying, that banks do not just lose $500,000. So I told her something I had not yet said out loud. I told her that the trust had now been turned into a foundation in my sister's name. That the $500,000 she thought was her ticket to an ocean view was already committed to helping widows and grandmothers keep roofs over their heads. I watched her eyes harden as she realized there was no angle left to work. No way to guilt me into changing what had already been done. She called me selfish, said I was choosing strangers over my own family, and I answered that family does not try to quite quietly strip a person of everything they have earned. Family does not sit in bank offices and sign away someone else's future without their knowledge. My son finally spoke then, his voice low, telling her that he had seen the papers, that he knew about the other name and the bankruptcies. And for the first time since I had known her, she did not have a quick line ready. She looked from his face to mine and saw that the story she had been spinning for years was no longer holding. She left my kitchen without slamming the door, which somehow felt louder than any shout. And as the sound of her footsteps faded, I sat there with my hands flat on the table, feeling tired but steady, knowing that whatever happened between them next, I had done the one thing I could control. I had refused to let my sister's last gift become just another chapter in someone else's trail of broken promises. After she left that day, the house felt strangely quiet. But it was not the heavy kind of quiet I had known in the past. It was lighter, like a room that had finally been aired out after years of stale breath. In the weeks that followed, there were no more calls about beach houses, no more pictures of ocean views waved in my face. My son came by alone a few times, looking older than he had any right to look, and we sat together over simple meals, sometimes talking, sometimes just listening to the clock and the sound of the wind outside. He did not ask me to undo the foundation or unlock the trust. He just asked if I was managing, if the roof still leaked by the back bedroom, if the heating was holding up through the cold nights. Slowly, the conversations shifted from money to memories, to small stories from his childhood that made us both smile in that soft, achy way. Every now and then, I would get a letter or an email from a woman I had never met, someone who had received help from the foundation, set up in my sister's name, a widow who had kept her house after all, a grandmother who had been able to repair a broken furnace before winter settled in. I would sit at this same table and read their words, and feel something warm move through my chest, knowing that the money my daughter-in-law once tried to grab for a beach house was now holding up real roofs over real heads. Not for show, not for pride, but for survival and dignity. And it reminded me that not every story about money has to end in bitterness. Sometimes it can end in quiet goodness, if you're brave enough to say no. I share all this with you because I want you to hear one thing clearly. You are allowed to protect what you have built with your own hands. You are allowed to draw a line when someone starts treating your life like a stepping stone to their dreams. Love without respect is not love at all. It is a transaction waiting to happen, and you do not have to sign your name at the bottom of it. So if you stayed with me all the way to the end of this story, thank you. It means more to me than you know to have you listen. If you would like to hear more of my stories and spend a little more time with me, please subscribe before you go. I will be right here at this same old table, waiting to talk with you again.